Okay, good afternoon. So this is part two of an introduction to Shir Hashirim, the Song of Songs. Last week we spent most of our time trying to understand why Shir Hashirim is called Kodesh Kadashim. It's like the Holy of Holies, as opposed to other songs or other writings. And we'll today hopefully focus on the connection between Shir Hashirim and Pesach. The first mention connecting Shir Hashirim with Pesach is actually in a very early source from the times of the Mishnah in Maseches Sofrim. There it actually talks about, I think reading it, I forget how it says it exactly, but the first two nights or the last, I think it says actually the end of the second day of Yom Tov. Whatever it says exactly is not how it's practiced nowadays. There's actually many different customs of when to read Shir Hashirim, especially amongst the Sephardic communities. Each one has its own custom. But Ashkenazim, certainly the widespread custom is to read Shir Hashirim on Shabbos of Chol HaMoed. So a Shabbos that comes out on Pesach. If there's no Shabbos in the intermediary days, the way the calendar comes out, so then it means that there's a Shabbos on either the first 2 days and the last 2 days, and then we would read it actually at the end of Yom Tov on the days of Yom Tov at the end of Pesach, whichever day is Shabbos. Fine. So we read it on Pesach, and what I want to talk about is why. What is the connection between Shir Hashirim and Pesach? So what we're going to do is we're going to learn together a piece from the Sfas Emes. The Sfas Emes was one of the rabbis of the Ger Hasidus, and he writes cryptically and deep, and that's why we're going to try to learn it together. But what I think he's saying here very much ties into what we discussed last week, so we'll use it to circle back to last week's discussion. So if you have the source sheet, you can follow along. If you don't, you can listen. The Sfas Emes says as follows. He says, that which we read Shir Hashirim on Pesach, ki Shir Hashirim hu levayer, because Shir Hashirim is to clarify, ki kol inyane olam hazeh rak mashal. All matters of this world are simply a mashal, a metaphor, lahavin, to understand ha'ahava hatzricha laHashem yisbarach, to understand the love that's needed or expected towards God, towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I'm going to read the whole thing and then we're going to try to understand it. He says, V'zeh perush Shir Hashirim. That's why it's called Shir Hashirim, the Song of Songs. Shemikol Hashirim sheba olam, because from all songs in the world, Yotzei Shir Hazeh, this song comes from all the other songs of the world. Now a person has to attach themselves, has to try to understand the nimshal, the interpretation of this metaphor. V'kasha, but it's difficult. It's hard for us to relate to the idea that everything that exists is just a means of a mechanism for us to know God and learn how to love God. And the more that we attach ourselves to this world, to worldly matters, it becomes even more difficult to the point where we can't understand the nimshal, the interpretation of the metaphor whatsoever. So for this Pesach, Passover, which is the time of our freedom, it's a time when a person can learn the will of God from the world, from Teva, from nature. On Rosh Hashanah, on Pesach, our inner Nikuda is like a point. So an inner point, like the neshama, I guess, is revealed. And therefore Shir Hashirim is relevant specifically on Pesach. So those are the words of the Sfas Emes. Like I said, he writes very cryptically, and and maybe we'll try to work together to understand what he's saying. So we're reading through it. Now we're going to go back through it again. So he says that the reason we read Shir Hashirim on Pesach is because the lesson of Shir Hashirim is that everything that exists in this world is a metaphor to understand the love we need to have for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So every relationship, even every human relationship, every experience that we have, every joy, every pleasure, it's all to be used to understand how we could connect to God, what we can gain from a connection with God. If we have a pleasure, I guess we'll start with a relationship in this world we learn to love. We're supposed to use that as a means to understand how we should love God. If we have a pleasure in this world, we should use that to understand the tremendous pleasure it is to connect, for our soul to connect to God. And that's the purpose of it. Now he says, and that's why he says it's called the Song of Songs, Shir Hashirim, because everything that in this world that might make us sing, whatever it is, it's an amazing relationship, it's an amazing pleasure, it's an amazing experience, that is meant to use as a means to then sing to God and connect and ourselves to God. So it's the Song of Songs. It's the song that emanates or manifests itself from all other experiences, all other songs. Now, to view the world in this way is difficult, and we have to treat our relationships like relationships, right? If like our spouse is just a means to love God, like it is on one level, but we can't treat a person that way. That's we have to treat a person. In fact, there's a midrash that says that one of the questions, there's different statements of the sages. What questions is God going to ask us when we come before Him? And to the tribunal, to the heavenly court, heavenly tribunal. One of the questions is, Himlachta es chavercha, did you make your friend a king? And I once heard an interpretation that, what does that mean, did you make your friend a king? So the simple understanding is just, it means like, did you treat them like royalty? Did you treat them well? But I believe it's the Alter of Slobodka who said that what it means is, when you did kindnesses for a friend or for a spouse, did you treat them like a king? Meaning, or did you say, I'm only doing this because it's God's will? So he says, you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to say, you're my lulav, right? A lulav we shake, it's a mitzvah. We do it because it's a mitzvah. So we're serving God. So I'm helping you because it's a mitzvah, but not for you. That's it. It's an interesting perspective, but it's saying that ultimately deep down we're doing it because it's God's will. But we that's not why we do it. When we do it for the person, we do it for them. We're not doing it for God unless we're doing it for the person. When we do the actual chesed, we have to make that person the king. We have to make, or the queen, right? Ultimately, it's for God. But on a personal level, we can't do that. But we're not supposed to. We're supposed to treat the person like I want to do this for you. That's the highest level. That's the higher level of chesed. So on the one hand, though, we're saying, but ultimately, it's to achieve an understanding of what our relationship with God should be. Even when it comes to honoring parents, the Sefer HaChinuch, who talks about the reasons behind mitzvos, explains that we're supposed to use our relation, I believe it's in the Sefer HaChinuch, our relationship with our parents and honoring our parents to understand how we're to honor God. If we didn't have that type of relationship and that type of expectation, it would be harder to then honor God. So everything in this world, he says, is ultimately for the purpose of understanding our relationship with God and developing a love for God. But it's very hard to relate to that on a regular basis. And specifically, he says, the more that we get involved in matters of the world, in olam hazeh, of worldly matters, of pleasures, the more we indulge and the more we entrench ourselves in materialism and the pleasure of the world, it's harder to relate to them as a means to achieve closeness with God and love of God. And therefore, we lose track of the nimshal. We lose track of the interpretation of this metaphor that the world is meant to be. So when can we tap into this metaphor a little bit better? He says on Pesach. Doesn't say why. He just says Pesach is the time of our freedom, that a person is able to learn the will of Hashem from nature as well. For our nekuda hapenimius, our inner will is revealed. I think part of it is that on Pesach, we have additional restrictions of not just, we have non-kosher like regular, but also chametz. And so we're in a way, we're separating ourselves from worldly matters in a even greater extreme than the rest of the year. And it's really a time where we take a step back from the pleasures of this world, and it's liberating. It's freeing. We're really being freed from the confines, the limitations that a life of chasing after pleasures puts us in. And this allows, he says, for this inner nekuda, this inner will, our deepest will, to be freed and to become revealed. And he says, therefore, Shir Hashirim is relevant in this time. And this, I think, really relates to what we spoke about last week. Last week, we spoke about how Shir Hashirim is Kodesh Kadashim. It's the Holy of Holies, because Shir Hashirim is a different kind of song. Other songs are, we said, based on a specific salvation, and they are ahava hatuya badavar. In a certain sense, they are dependent on something. Because we were saved, so therefore we express our love and our appreciation to God, or because of a great experience or whatever it might be. But Shir Hashirim is a expression of love that's not dependent on anything. We just for the sake of the relationship itself, just because we want to connect, we want devekus, we want connection to God. That's what Shir Hashirim represents. And therefore, in the thick and the thin, through all the travails of our history, we keep coming back and turning back to God and saying, but we search for you, and we desire a closeness to you. And to be able to have that close relationship, we have to be ready to give up a little bit of this world, or a lot of this world. We have to, in order to achieve the highest level of connection to God, the highest spiritual connection, a person has to be able to let go of Olam Hazeh, of this world, and disengage and be willing to bypass on some of the enjoyments of this world. And it's specifically on Pesach that we can tap into that. And like he says, we're revealing that inner point that is really, we're revealing our deepest will of our soul, because our soul isn't interested in anything from this world. Our soul simply wants to connect back to its source, which is God. So specifically on Pesach, we reach Shir Hashirim when that inner will is revealed, when we step back from the gashmios, the physical pleasures of this world. That's when we have the potential to gain this tremendous closeness that we're yearning for, and that we express through Shir Hashirim. That is what I think the Sfas Emes is saying. Just an interesting additional note: the Sfas Emes in another place adds another detail, not really related to this, but he says that the three holidays of Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot, each of them relates to a different part of us, meaning that Pesach relates to our speech, and Shavuos relates to our thoughts, and Sukkot relates to our actions. And he says, you see this because Pesach, first of all, Pesach, the main mitzvah, so to speak, the first night, is through telling over the story of the Exodus. And one of the hints to this idea in the name Pesach is that the words Pesach mean the mouth that speaks. And Pesach is a day of expression of the mouth. Shavuos is the time we got the Torah. That's where that's a day of relating to thought, because it's a day where we receive the Torah, which is what gives us the knowledge that of understanding God's will. And Sukkot is a day where there's just a lot of action. All the mitzvahs of Sukkot involve action, building the sukkah and shaking the lulav and esrog, and that's a day associated with action. But Pesach, being a holiday relating to speech and the expression of the mouth, that's the day that's the holiday where we say Shir Hashirim, he says, because Shir Hashirim is this great expression of the mouth, and is most associated with Pesach, a time where our praising, our thanks of God can flow forth. Okay, so that's the Sfas Emes, and that's tying us back to last week's class. Now, the much more basic approach, which we find in the commentaries of why we read Shir Hashirim on Pesach, is the one that the halachic sources quote, is very simple. Says the Abu Draham. Abu Draham was a early composition of commenting on the Siddur and different liturgy, including the Haggadah. So the Abu Draham says, second source on the source sheet, that the people are accustomed to reading the Song of Songs on the festival of Matzot on Pesach because it speaks about the salvation from Egypt, which is the beginning of the subjugation of Israel and their redemption. So because says the Abu Draham, very simple. You know why we read Shir Hashirim on Pesach? Because it talks about the Exodus. It talks about our time in Egypt, and it talks about the Exodus, and that's why we read it on Pesach. And it's a very simple, straightforward, and this is kind of picked up in the halachic sources when the Ramah, Ramosha Isserlis, quotes the custom to read Shir Hashirim on Pesach. Actually, I don't know if he says it, but the super commentaries on the Ramah say they bring this reason. They say because it talks about Pesach in Shir Hashirim. So what I want to do now is just highlight a few verses just in the first couple chapters, because I think that's where it's mainly focused. The talk about the Exodus. The later chapters, as it goes on, we progress in our history as a people. So the early chapters talk about our time in Egypt. I want to just highlight a couple of important ideas that relate to the Exodus, but also from the perspective of Shir Hashirim, meaning which talks about the love between the Jewish people and Israel. So fine. So actually, I'm just reminded, back to the point that the Sfas Emes was making about this entire world being a mashal, being a parable, a metaphor for understanding how our relationship with God should be. So there's a popular song right now based on a couple of verses in Shir Hashirim, a beautiful song that is being sung at many weddings, and it's a combination of a couple of verses from the third chapter of Shir Hashirim, the first verse and actually the second verse in the third chapter, and then the first verse in the fifth chapter. And the verse says, Akumana al-gera ba'sovava va'ir, and I will go around the city, ba'shvakim v'archavos, in the markets and the streets. Avaksha esh'ava nafshi, I will seek out that which my soul loves. Bikashtiv v'lo mitzasiv, and I sought it and I didn't find it. And then that's in verse 2 of the third chapter. And then in the fifth chapter it says, Basi ligani achosi kala. It says, I came to my garden, my sister, the bride. And there's a beautiful song that was written and sung at many chuppahs and many weddings. And it kind of was bothering me because in general, at Jewish weddings, we don't sing love songs between the bride and the groom. And furthermore, this Shir Hashirim is not we mentioned last week even the Aruch HaShulchan says that the one of the things that makes Shir Hashirim Kodesh Kadashim so holy is that you can't understand it at face value, because we wouldn't have just a love song, and by the way, there's also an interpretation of it. It's only a metaphor, and it's not meant as an actual love song. And so it bothered me, why are we singing this song at this, from these holy verses at weddings, as if like it's a love song between a bride and a groom, and the groom was looking for the kala, for the bride, and he went everywhere, as it says, I got up and I went around the city in the markets and in the streets, and I was looking, and then finally I came to my garden and I found her. Like, doesn't seem right to be singing this at a Jewish wedding. So maybe though we can justify the practice. I don't know exactly what the intent is, but perhaps we can say that it's true. It's just a metaphor, but the Sfas Emes is really saying that everything, all of our experiences are a metaphor. And so maybe it's really an expression that this relationship that I'm going into, as we walk down towards the chuppah, we walk down the aisle, is I understand that this is to be used ultimately to improve my relation, my closeness to God, and I'm to learn from the love and the seeking of a kala, of a bride, and a bride and a groom, to how we should seek out our relationship with God. And so it is a metaphor, but we're really expressing that everything is to be a metaphor. Everything is to be understood as a means, a mechanism to improve our relationship with God. So maybe if anybody wants the link for the song, you let me know. I'll send it to you. It's a beautiful song. Okay. Okay. So back to the Abu Dram. So the Abu Dram says that we read Shir Hashirim on Pesach because it talks about the events of the Exodus in Shir Hashirim. So I want to just highlight a few verses and discuss them a little bit. So if you have the source sheet, we're looking at chapter 1, verse 4, and it says there, "Mashcheni acharecha," draw me after you. Or Mashcheni drami acharecha narutza, we will run after you. Haviyani hamelech hadarav, the king brought me to his chambers. Nagila v'nismach bach, we will rejoice and be glad in you, etc. So this verse, it says Mashcheni acharecha, draw me, either draw me after you and then we'll run, or draw me and we will run after you, depending on how you want to do it. But it's saying, God, pull me and then I will run after you. And the Sfas Emes says, going back to the Sfas Emes, that this is essentially what happened to us in Egypt. We know, the Midrash teaches us, and if you look on the next source, Shemos chapter 12, it says that when Moshe commands the people to prepare the Pesach offering, the Karban Pesach, it says, and Moshe called to the elders of Israel, and he said to them, Mishchu, draw forth, ukechu lachem tzon, and take for yourselves sheep, for your families, v'shachatu Pesach, and slaughter the Karban Pesach. So this word mishchu, draw forth, the Midrash, Rashi quotes an earlier verse actually, but the Midrash on this pasuk, on this verse, says that what it means is that at that time, the Jewish people had become greatly assimilated into Egyptian society in Egypt and were serving idols as much as the Egyptians. And God was saying, Mishchu means like pull away, pull your hands away. Actually, no, it means to Moshe. I always get confused. Moshe is to push or to pull. I think it's to pull. So it means pull your hands away from the the idols. Mishlu. Pull your hands away from the idols, withdraw from the idols, and take for yourselves a sheep for the mitzvah. So for this carbon. So mishchu is pull away, and then bring the carbon pesach. And then just a few verses later, it says in verse 39, next source, still in that same box, and they baked the dough that they're taking out of Egypt as unleavened cakes, for it not leavened, for they were driven out of Egypt, and they could not tarry. And also they had not made provisions for themselves. So the people are leaving Egypt. As we know, they don't have time. There's no time for the dough to rise. They just take their matzah. And it said they didn't take anything else. That's it. They didn't take any provisions with them. So Rashi comments there. He quotes another midrash, and the midrash says they had not made provisions for themselves for the trip. This verse tells of Israel's praise, namely that they did not say, "How will we go out into the desert without provisions?" Instead, they believed and left. They trusted God. God said, leave, they're going to leave. This is what is stated explicitly in the prophets. So the verse says in Yirmiyah, in Jeremiah, it says, Zacharti la chesed nurayach. God says, I remember the loving kindness of your youth. Ahavas kululosayach, the love of your nuptials. You're following me in the desert in a land not sown. That we showed a tremendous trust in God by leaving without provisions. Who goes out into a desert without any provisions? You don't do that unless you trust in the one taking you out. And so the Sfas Emes points out that look at the leap that we took from just a few verses earlier. It says we were worshiping idols, and God says, leave the idols. And then all of a sudden we have such a trust in God that we walk out into this desert without anything to eat except for a little matzah, and that's it. And the idea, he says, is that what God is saying is when God reached out to us and said, I want you as a people, leave the idols behind and come to me, then we, so to speak, ran after him. And he says that's what this pasuk, this verse in Shir Hashirim is telling us. That just as when we left Egypt, God drew us after him, and then we ran. As soon as he gave us a sign, it's like he winked at us, and we went running after him. So that's what we are singing about here in Shir Hashirim as well, and here in exile, right, where sometimes it's hard to see God's love, but a little hint is all we need. We declare, and we saying we're ready to run after you. And it's this two-way, like any relationship. When one feels love from the other, then it's easier to love back. And that's what we're telling God, that just a little sign, just as in Egypt, a little sign, that's all they needed, and then our ancestors were able to run after you. So too, we could do the same, and in fact, this is a special power, a special ability that we have on Pesach. Pesach, we talk about Pesach being a day where we can jump. We can now. We have to understand though, it's a day we can jump, and then we have to after that go through a process of 49 days of the Omer. But on Pesach itself, on the night of Pesach, there's many hints to this, that the first night of Pesach, at the Seder, we kind of take a leap. They say that it's hinted to in the words Kadesh or Chatz. It says sanctify yourself and then wash yourself, the first two steps of the Seder. Now, usually, you wash yourself clean, and then you sanctify yourself. But here it says, we say Kadesh, sanctify yourself, and then wash yourself. Kadesh or Chatz. It's like, you gotta just, on Pesach, we leap right into it. We're ready to take a leap in our spirituality. Usually we need a process, and we do still, and that's what follows Pesach. But on Pesach itself, a person can take a tremendous leap, and this is what happened when we left Egypt. We took that leap, like we said. We went from being idolaters and to all of a sudden being these great people who had this tremendous trust in God, and then Narutza. Then we ran after God. That could be a hint. Stasema says elsewhere to the end of Pesach, the last day of Pesach, the seventh day of Pesach, is the day of the splitting of the sea, where the Jewish people entered the sea. They ran after God, and then the next part of the verse says, "Haviani amal chadarav." Then the king brought us into his chambers. That's the giving of the Torah at Shavuos. And then Nagila v'nismachabach, we will rejoice with you. That's Sukkot. So when the which is associated with tremendous joy. So this verse has within it the different holidays. Mashcheni acharecha, God draw us after you. That's Pesach, where God kind of pulled us out of Egypt. And then Narutza, we ran on the seventh day of Pesach into the sea, into the Yam Suf. And then Haviyani Amal Chadarav, the king brought us to his chambers. That's Shavuos, where he brings us into his innermost chambers. He gives us his Torah. And Nagila v'nismachabach, we will rejoice with you at Sukkot time. Okay, so there's one verse that's already talking about the Pesach, but also this relationship, this give and take, this when God signals to us, so then we run after him. That God shows us his love, then it's easier for us to love back. Going ahead a few verses, the next source, still in the first chapter, there's a few verses here describing the again, there's everything's a metaphor. So there's different ways to interpret. Different commentaries have different interpretations. But in verse 11, it says, Torei zahav na'aseh lach im nekudos hakesef. We will make you rows of gold with studs of silver. So Rashi quotes the Midrash that understands this verse and the verses around it to be talking about what happened at the splitting of the sea. And what happened there was, says Rashi, we will make you rows of gold. I, my tribunal, decided before the arrival of Pharaoh that I should entice him and strengthen his heart to pursue you with all the best of his hidden treasures, that we should make rows of golden ornaments for you with studs of silver that were already in your possession, that you took out of Egypt. For the plunder at the sea was greater than the plunder in Egypt. In other words, Rashi tells us based on the Midrash, what this verse is hinting to is that even though we know that during the plague of darkness, we went and took took riches from the Egyptians, which they owed us, but we took riches from the Egyptians. When they chased after us at the sea, they had with them great valuables, and when they drowned, those valuables were washed up on the side on the banks of the sea, and the plunder, the rewards that we received at the sea were even greater than those received in Egypt. That's what this is hinting to. That it was like what we got in Egypt was like silver. What we got at the sea, that was like gold. And the question we can ask is why? Why did that? Did we not have enough already? We needed more. What was the purpose of this event, of this occurrence? Maybe to just add one more question. In the Haggadah, the first night of Pesach is the 15th of Nisan. It's the day that we left Egypt. We don't really talk about 7 days later when we got to the Yam Suf, when we had the miracle of the splitting of the sea. It's not really part of the story that we're trying to tell that night. We're trying to tell about the Exodus and not what happened a week later. There's a mention of it here and there, but not much. It's mentioned in Dayenu, but there's lots of things mentioned in Dayenu. But there's one place where we really actually do talk about it, which is we have this, after we talk about the Makos, we have Rabbi Yossi Aglili said that even though how do we know that in Egypt there were 10 plagues, but at the sea there were 50 plagues? And he says, because in Egypt it talks about the finger of God, and by the sea it talks about the hand of God, so it's 5 times as many. So if there were 10 in Egypt, then there were 50 at the sea. And then comes Rabbi Eliezer and he says, no, you got your numbers wrong. In Egypt, it was 10, but it was really like each of the 10 was really like 4. So it was like 40. And if there were 40 in Egypt, then there were 5 times as many at the sea, then there were 200 at the sea. And Rabbi Akiva says, no. It was really 50 in Egypt. And if there were 5 times as many at the sea, then it was 250. So besides for like, what does that mean that there were so many plagues at the sea? That's its own question. But why are we even talking about this at the Seder? We're not talking about what happened at the sea. We don't sing the song of the sea as Shir. We're talking about what happened. We're like trying to one up what happened in Egypt. Right here we are, we're celebrating the Exodus, how amazing it was, the amazing miracles, the 10 plagues. And then along come these rabbis and they say, 10, that's nothing. Just wait till next week. That's going to be much more exciting. There were 50 or, 40, there were 205 times as many. It's way better. Why are we talking about this at the Seder? So Rabbi Yisrael Reisman gives a beautiful answer. He says that when God promised Abraham, that we were going to be enslaved, but that we would be taking out birchush gadol, with great wealth. So when the Jewish people get taken out of Egypt, so they might have thought, and rewarded with great wealth. So they might have thought, well, it's great, but it's not that God loves us or anything. He promised Avram that he was going to do it, and therefore he has to do it. Right? If somebody promises somebody something, and then they come through on their promise, doesn't show love to that person. It's just somebody fulfilling their obligation. So the actual Exodus doesn't necessarily show that God has special love for us. Yes, he punished our enemies, but he had to do that. He told Avram that he was going to do that. Yes, he gave us great wealth, but he told Avram that was his promise. So he's just fulfilling his promise. Nothing to do with us, not because he loves us. It was only when we got to the sea, and there was no promise. There was no promise about what would happen at the Yam Suf. We were out of Egypt. It could have been our end even at that point. There was no promise to punish our enemies at that point. There was no promise to give us wealth at the sea. So those miracles and that wealth showed that it really revealed to us that the whole thing was out of love. It wasn't just because he had promised Avram. But by now doing it, so to speak, voluntarily, without any promise, God did not promise us great wealth. He gave us even more. You know why? God was saying, because I love you. Because I love you. It's purely out of love. And this really revealed to us that the whole time it was out of love. In case we had any doubts, which we might have. We might have said it was just because of Abraham, just because of God's promise to Abraham. But now it became clear that no, the entire thing was out of love. And that's why it's worth mentioning at the Seder, because it really puts into perspective even the night of the Exodus. Because we might have thought that Exodus, that which God took us out, that which God gave us wealth, was only to fulfill Avram's promise. But by saying no, but look, later on, he performed even more miracles for us. And as we see in Shir Hashirim, he made us even richer. So that shows that the whole time it was out of love for us. So another expression, this verse, verse 11 of chapter 1 of Shir Hashirim, that we will make you rows of gold with studs of silver, is really an expression of that love once again. And finally, I want to take you to chapter 2, where we have the following. Chapter 2, verse 8. Kol dodi hine zeba, the sound of my beloved. Behold, he is coming. Midaleg al harim mekapetz al agvos, skipping over the mountains, jumping over the hills. My beloved resembles a gazelle or a fawn. Behold, he is standing behind our wall, looking from the windows, peering from the lattices. In Hebrew, he's standing behind the walls. Mashkiach min achalonos, peering from the window. Meitzitz min acharakim, peering through the cracks. And then my beloved raised his voice and said to me, arise, my beloved, my favorite one, and come away. and go. For behold, the winter has passed, the rain is over and gone. What is this verse talking about? So let's learn Rashi together. Says Rashi, the sound of my beloved. The poet returns to earlier topics, meaning he's going back to chapter 1, where, as he explains, like a person who was brief with his words and later said, I did not tell you the beginning of the matter. Let me go back. We were talking about the Exodus. Let me go back to what happened before the Exodus. He commenced by saying, the king brought me into his chambers, right? Haviani Amal Chadarab, like we read before. He brought me into his chambers, but did not tell how he remembered them in Egypt with an expression of affection. Where do we see an expression of affection? And now he returns and states, this attraction that I told you about, that my beloved drew me, that verse that we quoted before, Mashveni acharecha, and I ran after him, came about as follows. I had despaired of the redemption until the completion of the 400 years that were foretold in the Bris Hashirim, the covenant between the parts, that we had given up. We weren't going to get out of Egypt early. It was going to be 400 years there. But then we heard the sound of my beloved. Behold, he is coming before the end. As one skipping over the mountain and jumping over this, God skipped over. God hurried up the redemption. My beloved resembles a gazelle in the swiftness of his running, for he hastened to come like a gazelle and like a fawn of the hinds. God hastened the redemption from Egypt. Behold, he is standing. I expected to remain detained for many more days, and behold, he informed me that he was standing and peering from the windows of heaven at what was being done to me. As it is written, I have indeed seen the affliction of my people. We read this verse, I think in Haggadah. Re'ei ra'isi es ani ami. I have seen the affliction of my nation. God was watching what was going on. And he raised his voice and he said, to me, to our nation, through Moses, through Moshe. And he said, he said, get up and go. I will bring you up from the affliction of Egypt. So what we express here is that it's not just, again, I think it relates to what we just said, that, time was up. God promised that he would take us out, and time was up, and so he took us out. No, actually, according to this interpretation, at least, God took us out early, and he was watching us the whole time. He was, as described in the verse, he was standing behind our wall, looking from the windows, peering from the lattices, and sort of awaiting a time when he would take us out. And it says, verse 11, for behold, the winter has passed, the rain is over and gone. Now it's time to take you out. It's the best season to leave. Now is the time. It's the spring. I'm gonna take you out now. And God was waiting for that. And so again, the way that Rashi interprets this is an expression of God's affection for us, that he did not just ignore us and abandon us. He was watching us the whole time and waiting for the right moment when he would take us out. And again, Shir Hashirim speaks of this mutual love between us and God. And when we understand that God loves us in this way, then we will in turn return that love back to him. And so the God's taking us out of Egypt and the miracles that he brought for us and his watching over us. So that's all an expression of God's love. And so Pesach time, when we review that story and we internalize it, and we internalize the love that God has for us, so it's also a time where our love for God should hopefully grow and increase, and hopefully when we read through Shir Hashirim, we'll have a newfound appreciation for what we're trying to express.
Thank you, Rabbi.